Hi, my name is Beacock, and I'm a strategist and researcher at GEMIC. On behalf of my collaborators at Google, Jigsaw, and the University of Cambridge, I'd like to speak about our paper, Practicing Information Sensibility, How Gen Z Engages with Online Information. This is a qualitative study about how young people in the US between the ages of 13 and 24 encounter, seek, and assess online information in their daily lives. Our goal was to understand how Gen Zers make sense of online information to help reduce their vulnerability to misinformation. Now, before I tell you about our method and our findings, I'd like to tell you a little bit about one of our participants and an information journey that she reported to us. This person came across a clip from the National Geographic documentary Trafficked, not by searching, but on TikTok. She thought the criminal activity described had to be fake or staged, but it was a source that she had heard of before, National Geographic. So she went into the TikTok comments to see what other people thought. Most people there believed that the video was definitely faked. But our participant wasn't sure. So that's when she went to Google to search for more information about the documentary. In her words, though, all she found were trash sites that copy-pasted the same content or just quoted people's opinions from social media. So even though she couldn't get a clear answer, she got tired of searching, went back to TikTok, and kept scrolling. This study builds on existing HCI literature about information seeking by focusing on the internet as it's now experienced by Gen Zers, oriented more around mobile phones and social media scrolling than desktop browsers. We set out to answer 3 research questions. First, about information seeking. Why, where, and how do Gen Zers seek information online? Second, about information assessing. How and when do they try to evaluate the accuracy, quality, or credibility of online information? And finally, about misinformation. What factors affect the vulnerability of Gen Zers to online misinformation? To answer these questions, we conducted a mixed method study with 35 Gen Z internet users aged 13 to 24. At the core of this approach were qualitative in-depth interviews, which we conducted remotely. We first spoke with our participants in dyads to put younger participants at ease and help us examine social dynamics. Then we asked each person to complete a short diary about their online information habits, and we used those results to guide one-on-one follow-up interviews. During the interviews, we asked participants to perform searches and share their screens with us, and we also tested several information literacy intervention concepts. This combined approach allowed us to see Gen Z information practices in the context of their daily lives and identify the tensions between what users say they do and their actual habits. What we found were several online information practices that are not well captured by most existing research. First, we found that Gen Zers tend to follow nonlinear information journeys. They increasingly encounter information in the wild on social media apps and within the orbit of important social influences, rather than explicitly searching for answers to questions or going to news sites. As one participant put it, "I use social media to keep up with current events because it'll come across my feed. I don't sit down and watch the news every morning. I'll just use TikTok or Instagram and see what's happening." We also learned that seeking and assessing online information are fundamentally social practices for Gen Z internet users. They often process information together, not as individuals, and they engage with it for a range of social purposes, not only to find truth or verify accuracy, but to belong and build relationships and define their identities. When they encounter online information, they do sometimes ask, is this true? What's the source? And is it credible? But they're more often motivated by questions like, what do I believe about this topic? What do people like me think? Where does my family stand? And why are so many people sharing this information? Together, we call this information sensibility, a socially informed awareness of the value of information encountered online, relying on folk heuristics of credibility. We started this study wanting to gauge information literacy among Gen Zers, but we quickly found that our participants were asking different questions and behaving in ways that literacy-based frameworks don't completely capture. For the most part, they weren't acting as individuals searching for truth. They were encountering and metabolizing information together and using it to orient themselves socially. They were practicing information sensibility. So, what does information sensibility actually look like in the lives of Gen Zers? Our participants relied on 4 key practices. First, we found that Gen Zers often crowdsource their credibility judgments. They look to other people and to the discourse to see if a piece of content is trustworthy. but also to see what people like them think about it and how they're reacting. They do this by scanning the comments on platforms like TikTok or YouTube, or heading to forums like Reddit. In the story I shared at the beginning of this talk, our participant used TikTok comments to get a sense of how credible that National Geographic video was. In the words of another participant, most of the time I use the comments to see what other people are saying, if they're confirming it or denying it or correcting it. I try to double check my sources with the comments, by Googling, and with other content creators and what they say. Gen Zers crowdsource credibility to know if something is worth trusting, but this practice also helps them orient socially to the information. It can help them avoid the high social costs of being wrong, including being left out, ostracized, or even canceled. Second, we found that Gen Zers value everyday experience very highly. They look for evidence that the person giving the information is there on the ground, or that they've got some authentic personal experience to share. This kind of credibility heuristic, focusing on what people can see, hear, and feel for themselves, is partly a reaction to declining trust in traditional gatekeepers and institutions. It's not always clear, however, that Gen Zers are so well equipped to critically evaluate the authenticity of the personal experience that's being claimed. Third, we found that Gen Zers often engage in surrogate thinking. They identify a small number of go-to personalities whose opinions and worldviews they share and whose thinking they trust. In many cases, surrogates are celebrities or influencers, people like Jordan Peterson or Justin Bieber. Sometimes the surrogates are family members, an uncle who's well-informed or a cousin with firsthand experience. In these cases, users trust their surrogates to filter information and do the work of processing it for them. One of our participants prided himself on being a person who checked sources in general, but he didn't feel he had to do this when he was consuming information from Jordan Peterson, a trusted surrogate. You know, he told us, I generally take him at his word. I know he's intelligent and well-read, but I guess now I'd be more inclined to fact-check. In the past, I've just taken him at his word because I know he's very well-read. Surrogate thinking is an important way that Gen Zers try and cope with information overload, but it also serves a social purpose. By selecting surrogates to trust and associate themselves with, Gen Zers can express who they are and in some cases reinforce important family relationships. Fourth and finally, we found that Gen Zers use what we call good enough reasoning to calibrate the effort required to find and verify information. Whether the effort is worth it to find a definitive answer depends on the social purpose the information serves and how much uncertainty users are willing to tolerate. So someone might be willing to give up on knowing whether or not a National Geographic clip on TikTok is fake after just a bit of searching. Or in another example, whether or not Katy Perry killed a nun. But the same person might want to pursue the factual truth about the war in Ukraine until they're absolutely sure. In many cases, good enough information just means being certain enough to win an argument with a parent or on Twitter, or to talk with friends about it confidently. As one of our participants advised, back up what you say. Make sure you don't look like an idiot on the internet spewing something and then it turns out that you're completely wrong. You could definitely have a very non-factual take on something, and that could affect the way people view you. But it's also okay just not to know or care if it's not relevant to you. Taken all together, these 4 core information sensibility practices help Gen Zers figure out what's true and what they should believe online to the best of their abilities at a time when that's harder than ever. But they also help Gen Zers orient themselves socially, figuring out who they are, where they belong, and how they relate to others. Our work suggests that before we work to overwrite Gen Zers' information practices with new literacy competencies, we should try to understand the utility and value of information sensibility from the user perspective. Interventions should always be embedded in users' social context and, if possible, work with the grain of their social drives and needs. Certain information sensibility habits, like good enough reasoning, could even be worth strengthening and could lead to new normative competencies. We should also study information sensibility practices for other age groups, cohorts, and geographies. In other words, to effectively improve Gen Zers' resilience to misinformation, we first need to accept that seeking and assessing online information are profoundly social practices. Information literacy and information sensibility are 2 sides of the same coin. Thanks so much for watching, and thanks to everyone who helped us with this work. We're looking forward to learning from everyone at CHI.